Hi, I'm Philip from the HANA Academy. In this series of videos, we're looking at the SAP Automated Predictive Library, or APL. In this video, we're going to do some model building and applying and predicting using the SAP Predictive Analytics desktop. We're going to do that against HANA on the back end using the APL and having the processing delegate down into HANA, which gives us a great sweet spot in terms of performance. Now, in the previous video, we installed the Predictive Analytics desktop client. And we can see we've got different options in here. Now, just one quick option before we get started. If we go to File, Preferences, you'll notice that there is a Model Training Delegation. And by default, it's turned on. So when you've got the correct scenario, you're doing classification, regression, clustering, time series, or association, but not recommendations or social analysis at this time. There are one or two other things that don't work, such as custom cutting, etc. Then if you've got the right version of the APL on your HANA system and you connect to a HANA system with the corresponding version of the APL or the Predictive Analytics desktop client, then it will try to delegate where possible. However, if you don't want that to happen, you can always undo this checkbox, turn it off, but it's probably something you do want to have happen because it's going to normally give you a great performance boost and really optimize what you're doing with HANA. So we're going to go into the modeler because we're going to do some classification and regression. So we're going to create a model. Now, the example we're going to do is going to be against the auto insurance fraud. It's the same example we've done in other videos in this series where we actually wrote the SQL code to use the APL directly. This time it's going to be done actually from the desktop client. We won't have to write one line of code. So I'm going to create a classification regression model. And I need to specify a data type. Where's the data coming from? And for that, I'm going to say from a database. And then when I hit Browse, it gives me a list of data sources I could use. And here we see is the HANA one. I remember in the previous video, we set that up by creating an ODBC data source name that pointed. And of course, we installed the HANA client tools to get the HDB ODBC driver. So I'm going to log in with a user that's got all of the correct rights. If you remember in previous videos, we created a user underscore APL. And it's important that you use a user that's got all of the rights. When we did the initial setup and getting started with the APL, we created that user and we assigned him the rights needed. If you want to access from the desktop client, you need those rights as well. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So let's hit connect. And we can see it then gives us a list of schemas effectively in the catalog or potentially content. If you have analytic views or something like that, then these are things you can access through content. But let's go to the catalog. We know we've got the APL samples schema, and in that we've got the auto claims fraud table. What we can do is go ahead and work with it. And then we can move on to the next step. So we basically set up our folder name, which is really a connection to HANA, and the auto claims fraud table for doing our training. What we then need to do is press Analyze, which is up here on the top left, to actually analyze that input data, and it will make all sorts of assumptions, normally pretty good guesses on what we've got in the data. So, for example, it's identified the 15 columns, the claim ID first, then the 13 independent variables or dependents, and then we've got the is fraud column. But what we do need to do is specify that this one is the key. You see, actually, it is saying key. So normally we should be okay. So let's go ahead and move to the next one. And what we can see is it's actually worked out, yep, these are the 13 explanatory variables. It's not used the claim ID because he knows that's the ID. And is it fraudulent? That column at the very end, because it was the last column, he knows that's going to be our target. Of course, you can come and play around if your data doesn't fit this structure, but in our example, it fits quite nicely. So we can hit next, and then we can go ahead and actually ask it to do some in this case it thinks of doing a regression, so we can ask it to go ahead and build this. So we can hit generate. Now what's happening here, and if you look at the messages, you'll see rather than downloading the data and doing the model building on HANA, it's actually doing delegation to the APL that's already on HANA. So it actually did the processing directly on HANA, and just the results actually come down to the desktop client. So it's now been done. We can see that it's run. We can hit next. And now we've got a set of reports we can look at. And this is a real big advantage of working with the desktop client, is that you get lots of really nice, good reports. So we can see the model overview, well, we already saw that. We can see the contribution by different variables. So we can see, for example, the bodily injury amount seems to be a very high contributor. In the example where we wrote the SQL code, there was a select statement that kind of did the same thing. But here, you don't have to write any code, and you get a lot of different contributions based on different ways of approaching it. So variable weights, etc., etc., etc. So some pretty advanced analytics there. We've got the stats report. So here we can see just more of general information, descriptive what's in there. We can get all sorts of interesting stats from here as well. So very comprehensive reporting available based on all sorts of different variables, in fact, all the variables. So if you want to look at previous claims and look at the cross stats, then we can see that as well, how many are fraudulent or aren't fraudulent, etc., etc., for the different values. So lots of really great complementary information. We can even get a confusion matrix that shows us a truth table, basically, of a predicted yes and no and maybe false positives, etc. So some really, really nice analytic capabilities. We can also go and see some model graphs. So if we want to look, for example, at detected, we can see based on fraud, we can really see in more detail how that model was created. You'll learn more about what you can do with all these charts and graphs actually when you are using the documentation. There is full online help available here, searchable help actually in the product. So that's something you also maybe want to think of looking at. In fact, it's going to be online typically as you're working. And what's quite useful, if you do look at this, you'll get for 2.4, it talks about the delegation and it will give you more information, and specifically it gives you a list of exactly what versions you need, which is what we're using, APL 2.4, SPS 10, revision 102.02 or higher, and also saying what you need to have the same version on the client and the server. You need to have the right user with the right permissions, and then some restrictions, for example, recommendation and social are not yet available in 2.4, and custom cutting and using the decision tree are not yet supported either. But for many use cases, you can really take advantage of this delegation capability. Now that we've trained our model, we can think about applying it, maybe run that against some new data to try to identify likely fraud. So what we can do is go to the Run option, and on the right we have Apply Model. So what we can see, it knows that we're working with the database, we're on HANA. We need to point it at a data set that has some source data. So we can just click, for example, on Browse, and we can select from the samples schema, we can select Auto Claims New. And if you want, you can actually have a look at the data. We can see we've got the claim ID. We've got the same 13 or so pieces of information, but at the end, we do not have the is fraud flag, because that's what we want the apply to identify for us. So we can close that. There are lots of options here. We can define mappings, etc., but normally the defaults should work in this example. Because predictive analytics really does try to understand as much as it can of your data automatically. That's why it's the automated analytics. And we can see we've got lots of options in terms of what we create. Let's just go for predicted value only. And then we've got where do we want to put our results, and again we can define here a table. For example, if a table exists, we could select it, or I can just go for a new table. But what I'm going to do is put that into my own user schema, so user_APL. Obviously I need the rights to do that, it's my own schema, so I can, and then I can make a table, for example, auto claims results. So I can create my own table there. We'll use direct apply in the database by default, and we can then go ahead and apply. And we do that, it takes just a couple of seconds. It will now delegate that process, run it in the HANA database, and we can see our output. So we can see we've got a new table called Auto Claims Results created, and it's got the claim ID of that input data, and we've got a column here for is fraud. Basically, we can sort by it if we want to. We can see now what is the probability or likelihood of having fraud. So we can see that some 79%, 78%, we can see these are the claims at the top, having sorted it, the ones that are maybe more likely to be fraudulent. Of course, it's not an exact science, we're dealing with data mining, but these are certainly some claims that we maybe want to do further analysis of. Now, if you want to, you can also go to HANA Studio, and if you go to the APL user and we just refresh our list of tables, then we should be able to also see that's our auto claims result table sitting there happily in HANA, and we can preview it. And of course, if we embed that into application, we can do all sorts of work with that ourselves later as well. So we've seen how we've used the Predictive Analytics 2.4 client when we're working against data that's from HANA. Actually delegate the processing for both building and training the model, but also applying the model, doing all that on the HANA server, never having to bring all the data, all the source data down to the client. So really taking advantage of the APL, something you can work with on HANA.